Okay, pardon the delay there. Habakkuk, the New King James, Thomas Nelson, New King James has this brief introduction that I think helps to set the stage that Habakkuk ministers during the death throes of the nation of Judah. Although repeatedly called to repentance, the nation stubbornly refuses to change her sinful ways. Habakkuk, knowing the hard-heartedness of his countrymen, asks God how long this intolerable condition can continue. And God replies that the Babylonians will be his chastening rod upon the nation, an announcement that sends the prophet to his knees. He acknowledges that the just in any generation shall live by faith and not by sight. And Habakkuk concludes by praising God's wisdom, even though he does not fully understand God's way. And so then the second paragraph says that it's got a different spelling there. They use Q's. That Hebrew letter kuf is, or kaf is sometimes transliterated as a K and sometimes as a Q, but it's a word that means embrace. Or Habakkuk's name probably is intended to mean one who embraces or clings. So Habakkuk clings to God all the way through, regardless of what is going to happen to his nation in the meantime. So the theme of the book is that God will punish the house of Judah through Babylon, but then embrace a repentant Judah. Now, I think let me take this down, and I want to put something else back up on the screen. This is a chart. Let me scroll it up. This came out with the Bible reading program. So I hope you can see a chart, rulers and prophets of Israel and Judah. Okay, I got a thumbs up. Great. And so it starts way back in the 900s before Christ, all the way back to the division of the kingdom, Israel and Judah. And it has the prophets here in the center column. Now I'm going to scroll back down to the bottom because all of these prophets were working at a time when you had the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. But then in the 720s or 720-ish BC, the house of Israel fell. And so the prophets after that point had a primary ministry and focus on the house of Judah. So if I go down here to the bottom, we come down to, and we see Habakkuk right there, and on the timeline it shows him a little above 600 BC. This is on the heels of Josiah having been a more righteous king who brought about a number of renewals in Judah. Then, of course, in the battle, as it was described, he was killed in battle. And then after that, things went downhill very quickly. Jehoiahaz, just a brief 3 months. Pharaoh Necho of Egypt replaced him with Jehoiakim. And basically, Habakkuk's ministry would have taken place during this time of Jehoiakim's kingship. And the dates given are 608 to 598 BC. And so we go down here to the fall of Jerusalem. There actually are other of the minor prophets who had a ministry well after this time. For instance, Ezra and Nehemiah, in their time, it mentions that the prophets Haggai and Zechariah were there. And that was in the 520s BC or thereabouts. And then the last one is the last one in the Old Testament as we have it, and that's Malachi. And his ministry was more so around 430 BC. But we're focusing here just before 600 BC. So I'm going to take this chart down, and then I'll go back over to the notes again. So let me scroll up. Written to, of course, the house of Judah. It likely was included for Israel that had already been gone into national captivity. But certainly, as in any of the scriptures of God, the message is for God's people at any time, any place. So there certainly are lessons for us. The key message of the book is that the righteous shall live by his faith. And we find that in chapter 2. We'll get to that a little bit later. But Habakkuk opens up, and it appears that God is not answering, God is not hearing. He sees a lot of evil, and the wicked appear to prosper at that time. However, God's in charge, and in his time, he will intervene for his people. So the date, as was mentioned from the chart, most likely 610, 600, thereabouts, give or take a few years. And again, during the reign of Jehoiakim. Habakkuk would have been contemporary with Jeremiah, probably followed a little later than Zephaniah and Nahum. But he reveals that God is going to raise up the Babylonians, or he calls them the Chaldeans, to punish the house of Judah. And we need to remember the principle of prophecy called duality. There was a prophecy that was fulfilled in his time. The house of Judah was punished. They went into captivity in Babylon. They served the king of Babylon, as Jeremiah prophesied, for 70 years. Then they were restored. But you see, that is a forerunner for end time prophecies of, once again, a Babylonian type beast system that will arise and be used to punish the house of Israel and Judah once again. Now let's focus on Habakkuk. We don't really have a great deal that we're given about Habakkuk the man, but as mentioned in the introduction there in the New King James, Habakkuk means embrace. And he appears to have been a member of the Levitical temple choir. So of the tribe of Levi, we'll see chapter 3 is a psalm, and we see that there are some musical notations, such as the word Selah, which in a musical sense meant a pause or a hold. For us, I think in reading anywhere we see the word Selah, we just stop and think about it, meditate, ponder what we have just read. And then he also makes a statement at the beginning of chapter 3 that this is to be accompanied by stringed instruments. Actually, that was at the end of chapter 3. So again, it would make him from the tribe of Levi, but he's called Habakkuk the prophet, and we really aren't given much more than that. All right, historical background. Now, on the chart just above, one of the prophets just earlier than Habakkuk was Nahum, and Nahum had been sent to comfort Judah because Assyria had overthrown the northern house of Israel. And of course, they're living in fear. They're concerned. And yet Nahum was sent to let them know that the Assyrians that punished Israel is soon going to be punished itself. Now, I have a little bit there from Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary. The position of the book Habakkuk immediately after Nahum is appropriate. Nahum treated the judgments of the Lord on Assyria for its violence against Israel, and so Habakkuk, those inflicted by and on the Chaldeans for the same reason. And of course, Habakkuk adds the point that they're going to be punished as well. So Nahum had prophesied, and his message was that Assyria is going to fall, and they did. And yet it may have lulled Judah into a false sense of security. They let down. Habakkuk is crying out at the beginning about the evil, the oppression, and the fact that they had forgotten God. And they did not recognize that even though Assyria perhaps had just been destroyed, see, Nineveh, the capital, fell in 612 BC. So they didn't realize, though, that from the same area there was another power that was rising very rapidly. And the Babylonians would then absorb all the area of Mesopotamia and begin spreading. They are the ones who would become the punisher of the house of Judah. Let's skip down here a little more. I mentioned Josiah's reforms. Got a quote there from Isaiah 39. And Isaiah was writing closer to 150 years earlier. But Isaiah 39, verses 6 through 7, he says, "Behold, the days are coming when all that are in your house and what your fathers have accumulated until this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And they shall take away some of your sons who will descend from you, whom you beget, and they will be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." So again, that was well over 100 years beforehand. Specifically, Isaiah was warning Hezekiah that the treasures of Judah and some of his sons and others would be serving the Babylonians. Now, the Jews had little way of knowing much about the rising power in Babylon. Okay, let me, the last couple of lines there. It was not until Nineveh fell in 612 BC that then Babylon became fully independent and commenced her short but impressive career of conquest. See, the Babylonian Empire didn't quite have 1 century, 625, and then they fell to the Medo-Persian Empire in 539. But in that amount of time, they were conquering the known world very rapidly. All right, scrolling on down, here is a map I wanted you to look at because up here we have Assyria, Nineveh, the capital. They were the world ruling power before Babylon. You know, Daniel comes along, he has the vision of the great image, and Daniel begins with Babylon. Well, he's just picking it up at his time. Assyria had been the world empire. They fell. Down here in Babylon, you have the city of Babylon on the Euphrates. Nineveh was over on the Tigris River. But Babylon allied with Elam, or the Persians, and also the Medes up in this area. And they were instrumental in the downfall of Assyria. Looking at the larger view, over here we have the nation of Israel. So this is the kingdom that, as Babylon began spreading, they came all the way down, and they had warfare with Egypt. All right, Nabopolassar, that was Nebuchadnezzar's father. I tell you, they knew how to name their sons back then. It's a mouthful, a lot of their names. Evil Merodach, that was another name. I just mentioned this. He joined with the Medes. There was actually a marriage between the Babylonian line and the Median line. Okay, let me scroll on up here because we've got ground to cover. Here is just a basic 6-point outline. The first 4 verses of chapter 1, Habakkuk is introduced, and he's asking God, how long are the wicked going to prosper? How long will they triumph? From his point of view, it seemed that they were getting away with everything. Well, so we have like two different cycles where Habakkuk asks questions and then God answers. So to that question, verses 5 through 11, God lets him know that, I've got a plan. It's being worked out. I'm going to pick up Babylon now to use them as my tool to punish Judah for their sins. And so then when we get to verse 12 all the way through chapter 1 or chapter 2 verse 1, Habakkuk basically makes the argument that the house of Judah has its sins. It's forgotten you. It's drifted away from you. But he says the Babylonians are a whole lot worse. The way they are plundering and conquering and deporting peoples far and wide. So he made his case that, but they're a lot worse than we are, so why are you going to use them? It's the way human nature tends to think. But at the beginning of chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, that's where God reminds him, you've just got to patiently wait on me, and the just live by his faith. So then God explains more. Habakkuk 2, verses 5 through the end of the chapter, verse 20. That yes, they are a horribly wicked people, but they're going to be used to punish Judah. But then God assures him there's going to be a punishment on Babylon later on. And then chapter 3. Chapter 3 is the last part of the outline that it's a psalm, a song that Habakkuk sings to God. And he sees where God where God will punish the enemies of Israel and Judah, and then embrace and deliver his people. So let's start a survey here. And actually, as we get into this, I'm not going to stop and dwell on each verse. We're gonna move on a little because at least I envision just to give it a one-shot deal here tonight. Habakkuk has questions, and he is called the questioning prophet. And so in verse 1, he's got a burden, the burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw. This was an oracle, a revelation that God was giving to Judah through him. And so he's pointing out that in verse 2 that conditions are dominated by violence, oppression. There's a lot of strife. And so he asks God, why aren't you listening? Why, the age-old question, why do the wicked prosper? Why are the wicked getting away from it, with it? He's also, in that sense, asking, why don't you do anything? When are you going to act? So valid questions, understandable questions. It would be good to tie in actually two Psalms. I've got a few verses here from Psalm 37. Another Psalm would be Psalm 73. Both of those Psalms deal with this age-old question of why does the wicked prosper? And so in Psalm 37, in part here, verse 7 says, rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. And so verse 9, for evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait on the Lord, they shall inherit the earth. So even back in David's time, when the Psalms were being written, the question was asked and the answer was given. Wait on God. God is sovereign. His plan is being worked out, and he's not going to let his people slip out of his hands. In the next verses, talks about in verse 3 the plundering, the violence, the strife, the contention. So he's looking at conditions in the house of Judah. and talks about justice not going forth in verse 4, and the wicked surrounding the righteous. So it's a horrible picture that is being painted here. Verse 5, look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded. This is God speaking to him, God beginning his answer. Be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days which you would not believe, though it were told you. Now, this is an amazing statement in many regards, and one was that the power base in Babylon was only beginning to rise. And so Judah had little reason to suspect danger coming from Babylon now that Assyria had fallen. God saying that the punishment Judah is going to go through may have been too horrible for Habakkuk to be able to handle. Again, remember the principle of duality. There was a fulfillment when Judah fell, 604 to 585 BC. Babylon served as God's punisher. But then again, there will be an end time, Babylon the Great, and it will punish the end time descendants of Israel, the children of Abraham. And it too will fall the second time. Now in verse 6, for indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans. Now, Chaldeans and Babylonians are used interchangeably. Technically, the Chaldeans were a ruling class. They also were a priestly group. Some of the Chaldeans are spoken of as wearing black robes. So both a civil leadership role and also a priestly role within the overall peoples that consisted of Babylonia. They'll march through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places not theirs. They're terrible and dreadful. So again, just horrible. And we know enough from history to realize that what they did to Judah, they went in, they destroyed it, they burned the city, the temple, and that's where we're introduced to Daniel and friends, where a lot of the intelligentsia are carted off to Babylon and served the king there. Down to verse, talks about how swift they move in battle. Verse 9, for they come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. So God was using them to take Judah captive because of their sins. And in verse 10, the latter part, it says they heap up earthen mounds and seize it. The Assyrians were one of the first people that recognized and learned the value of building these earthen siege ramps to be able to breach a wall. And then Babylon learned it from them. Down to verse 11, then his mind changes and he transgresses. He commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. Now, I want to pause from that a little bit here. This brings in the aspect of the spiritual warfare behind the scenes in human conflict. It seems that it's always there, always has been. His spirit changes. He ascribes this power to his God, not the God who raised him up, but his God or gods. Now, again, remember the duality. So at the time of the end, there is a beast power that arises. In Revelation 13, verse 2, it says, the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. So we look back at times when the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, has arisen. And there have been leaders who have tapped into that unseen spirit world. Charlemagne, he was known for being clairvoyant. He knew what those around him were thinking. He knew what the enemies were thinking. Napoleon had had some kind of a mystical experience when he was a younger soldier, as France was down in Egypt, and he went into one of the pyramids, and he came out, and he was different. And Napoleon on the battlefield just knew he had extra help. He knew what the opponent was doing. And then, of course, Hitler. There were times, been a long time ago, I read a biography of Hitler, Der Fuhrer, by Conrad Hayden. And in one point, he talked about how sometimes Hitler, the look in the eyes is what gave it away. He would just turn into this human dynamo and begin barking out orders, and the High German command just quaking in their boots in front of him. I think another aspect to keep in mind here is 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 3 and 4. Because here it talks about that falling away and the man of sin being revealed, the son of perdition, and of a religious figure who actually moves his own headquarters down into Jerusalem and rules from there. So let's go into verse 12, because this is where Habakkuk comes back with his second question. In verse 12, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die, O Lord. You have appointed them for judgment. You have marked them for correction. You are of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously, and hold your tongue when wicked devours a person more righteous than he? And so in the next verses, basically, this is Habakkuk making his case that they're a lot worse than us. So why, God, would you use them to punish Judah? And he wants to know. Well, the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians, were also prophesied of later by Jeremiah. Jeremiah 25, verse 9. Behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, says the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land. So Jeremiah prophesied of Babylon, and specifically Nebuchadnezzar. So Habakkuk is making a case. Was he right? Well, on the one hand, God had given Israel every advantage. They were called with the intent that they would be as example nations, that through Israel all peoples would be blessed. And they were given his law. They were led directly. God intervened for Israel and Judah so many times, and they did nothing with it. They discounted it. And of course, there's a greater accountability. As Jesus said in Luke 12, verse 48, Luke 12:48, for everyone to whom much is given, from him much will be required. So God expected a great deal from Judah, just as he had from Israel, and they never came through. And so the story, the words go on, and let's see. Well, let me scroll this on up here. The end of chapter 1. Shall they therefore empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity? So he had been talking about how they had gone through, they had used their nets to catch people, the entire nations and peoples. And he's asking God, are you just going to allow them to run over Judah and then go on to other peoples as well? And of course, the answer to that short answer is yes. For a while, God was going to let that. God was working out his plan here. So in chapter 2, I will set my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am corrected. So Habakkuk sits as a watchman for Judah to await God's answer. And he is told in verse 2, write it down. What he was being given from God, Habakkuk was to write it down on a slate large enough where a passerby could read it easily. In verse 3, for the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it will speak, it will not lie, though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. So God tells Habakkuk, this vision is for an appointed time down the line. And of course, in God's due time, it became apparent Babylon did overthrow Judah, but then God also remembered his promise and he overthrew the Babylonians. The Chaldeans paid a terrible price for their sins and for what they did to Judah. In verse 4, behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. So God answers that the righteous are to live by faith. Judah was to, like Habakkuk, look beyond this physical life, trust in God, and hope in God, and know that things were going to work out in the end. They were to live their faith, live their lives by believing that God knows what he's doing. And we too are to patiently wait upon God as he is working out his plan and purpose among mankind here today. The wicked do prosper for a while. We need to remember those three words, for a while. Habakkuk was told the Chaldeans will be punished because God is sovereign and he reigns over the earth. It may appear that evil is triumphing, but it won't forever. In verse 5, indeed, because he transgresses by wine, he is a proud man. He does not stay at home because he enlarges his desire as hell. That's the Hebrew Sheol, the grave. He is like death and cannot be satisfied. He gathers to himself all nations and heaps up for himself all peoples. So this is where God is further explaining to Habakkuk that yes, it's just a part of their nature to go into battle, to conquer, and to subjugate peoples. But I thought it was interesting that he transgresses by wine. Remember from the book of Daniel, chapter 5, the story of the handwriting on the wall. That was the end of the Babylonian era. Babylon is just about to fall, and it would fall that very night. But it was, in Daniel 5, it introduces it as this drunken orgy that was taking place. And the hand appeared and wrote Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin on the wall. And then at the end of chapter 5 of Daniel, the Babylon fell to the Medes and the Persians. And that's a fascinating story. In verse 6, Habakkuk begins pronouncing a series of woes. There will be 5 of them against Babylon. Middle of verse 6, woe to him who increases what is not his. How long? To him who loads himself many pledges. So pledges are made to the conquering peoples. The Medes and the Persians, they entered the city of Babylon by stealth. It's a long story, a fascinating story. The Euphrates River was actually diverted, and they walked in through the dry riverbeds and had agents inside that opened gates, and they walked into the city in the midst of the orgy, the drunken orgy of Daniel 5, and the city was a piece of cake. As far as for the Medes and Persians, it fell very quickly. But the Medes and Persians, Remember, Book of Revelation also talks about the Euphrates River holding back these forces from the east, and a time comes when it will be dried up, symbolizing that these eastern forces are able to come in and punish the beast power. So again, the forerunner and then the latter fulfillment. Verse 8, because you have spoiled many nations, and the remnant of the people shall spoil you, or all the remnant of the people shall spoil you because of men's blood and the violence of the land, the city, and all that dwell therein. So again, it appears the wicked are triumphing, but God remembers, and there'll be a price to pay. We have another woe that begins in verse 9. And let's see. Verse 11 talks about the stones of the wall. The beams from the timber are personified as testifying against their sins. Actually, Nineveh had been called by the prophet Nahum. He had called them the bloody city. And then they the Assyrians fell to Babylon, and Babylon built on that bloodshed. They were a bloodthirsty people. Just their history of less than 100 years is a history of conquest. In verse 12, another woe. Woe to him that builds a town with blood and establishes a city by iniquity. Behold, it is not of the Lord of hosts. But then in verse 14, it's interesting. There is a millennial prophecy that is inserted here. For the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And that, of course, is largely a quote from something Isaiah would have written many years earlier, Isaiah 11, verse 9. The latter half of it says, the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So, verse 15, another woe. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbor, pressing him to your bottle, even to make him drunk, that you may look on his nakedness. Again, it's interesting that end time Babylon is spoken of back in, or down in, or rather in Revelation 17, the early first part of the latter part of verse 1 and verse 2. Revelation 17, verse 1. Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So end time Babylon will lead the world into spiritual drunkenness. It is her doctrines. It is the false prophet, the false church allied with them. And it mentions in verse 16, and be exposed as the uncircumcised. Well, if they are exposed as uncircumcised, that pictures the fact that they're not in a covenant with God. They are alienated from any relationship with God, but still God used them, or will use them again, as his tool to punish his people. All right, verse 17, for violence done to Lebanon will cover you, and the plunder of beasts which made them afraid, because of men's blood, and the violence of the land and the city, and of all who dwell in it. Now, Lebanon is a word that's used here and in other places to represent Israel. Yes, the city, including the temple, was going to be destroyed. The temple was in large part, the main beams were constructed of the cedar that came from the cedars of Lebanon that David and Solomon contracted with Hiram of Tyre. But they would completely destroy and burn the Temple of Solomon and do great violence. In verse 19, another woe. Woe to him who says to wood, awake. To silent stone, arise, it shall teach. Behold, it's overlaid with gold and silver, yet in it there's no breath at all. So Babylon had trusted in items of wood, stone, metal, etc., that were made by human effort. They can speak to them all they want. There's no breath in them. There's no life in these idols. But meanwhile, by contrast, verse 20, the Lord, the God, the true God, the only God, the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. And that's a reminder God reigns supreme, but also prophetically looks to a time when the feet of Jesus Christ will stand on the Mount of Olives, and the armies of mankind will be put down and destroyed. And Jesus will begin reigning as King of Kings over on the earth. And the time will come, as it says, let the earth keep silence. The earth, human beings will be told, just hush up. Time to be quiet and listen to God who has come to give you the answers. Well, let's go ahead then and shift to chapter 3. And this is his psalm or song. This psalm has been used in temple worship. It contains liturgical notations such as the words Shigionoth there in verse 1. Upon Shigionoth. We don't know the meaning. We don't know the meaning. It may have indicated a certain tone. Some suggest it denotes a lamentation, a heavy message, but we really aren't sure. Then there's the word Selah. It's used in verses 3, 9, and 13, and it means a musical pause, to just pause right there. But here we have Habakkuk's prayer to God. It's a psalm, it's a song, but it's also his prayer. He prays to God, praising him for his interventions for the people of Judah in times past. And he realizes now that in God's due time, he will intervene for Judah. He will restore them, and he will punish Babylon. So in verse 2, fascinating statement here. Let me scroll this up a little. Is received a response from God. O Lord, I have heard your speech and was afraid. So he had cried out to God with his question, and now God has spoken to him through whatever means, and was afraid. And then that was a reverential fear of God's judgments that he now understood are truly going to come. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. In wrath, remember mercy. So, a prayer. Remember your work. Bring back your work. Begin to embrace your rebellious people once again. Again, remember, the name Habakkuk means embrace. But Habakkuk views the power of the Chaldeans as being in a role similar to the Levites. The Levites were the tribe, the special group who served at the temple. They were the wise men. They spoke for God. And if the energies of the Levites were focused properly, then their zeal could influence the nation and lead them in a godly direction. They certainly could have been encouraging the people to patiently wait on God. But meanwhile, in the Chaldean Babylonian system, you had these Chaldeans who served as a type of a priesthood. And we find they're going to play a role. There is a role of the false church and of this false political military system at the time of the end. There will be a great false prophet, and he'll have his cronies assisting him in deceiving the world. But again, Habakkuk cries out to God, raise up your work. Speed the time when you work in your people's lives once again. In verse 3, God came from Teman. Now, Teman was, he was a descendant of Esau, I believe a grandson, but there was an area of Esau or Edom, also called Edomia, an area there called Teman. His peoples were there. The Holy One from Mount Paran, and that was a mountain over in the area of where Edom had come from. And so then the Selah, pause, stop, think of that. So this area of Seir was the area of Edom or Esau. Mount Paran was there. These areas were to the south and southeast from Jerusalem. And it's interesting that right at the end of Moses' life, Deuteronomy 33, verses 2 and 3, Deuteronomy 33, verse 2. This is Moses blessing the children of Israel. And then, of course, the next chapter, or, well, before long, he's going to die. And he said, that's Moses, the Lord came from Sinai and dawned on them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran. He came with 10,000s of saints. From his right hand came a fiery law for them. Yes, he loves the people. All his saints are in your hand. They sit down at your feet. Everyone receives your words. So Moses had sung of that, and this is something that Habakkuk is seeing will happen again as God is coming from the south, coming to intervene for his people. Verse 4, his brightness was like light. He had rays flashing from his hand, and there his power was hidden. So God's presence, as Habakkuk is envisioning it, is like the sun shining in its strength. Down to verse 6, he stood and measured the earth. He looked and startled the nations. The everlasting mountains were scattered. The perpetual hills bowed. All his ways are everlasting. So again, remember, oftentimes in prophecy, a mountain represents a larger nation and a hill represents a smaller nation. And, there are millennial prophecies about the mountains, the hills, and they're wanting to go up to the mountain of the house of the Lord. And he pictures them as now bowing in God's presence. Verse 8, O Lord, you were displeased with the rivers. Was your anger against the rivers? Was your wrath against the sea, that you rode on your horses, your chariots of salvation? Your bow was made quite ready. Oaths were sworn over your arrows. Selah. You divided the earth with rivers. So Habakkuk sings of God's pleasure in hurrying, hastening to deliver and save his people when that time comes in God's plan. Historically, the Red Sea had been held back. The Red Sea had been parted, and the Jordan River held back in giving God's people a deliverance. At the same time, those waters, like when the Red Sea came back together, Pharaoh's chariots were drowned in the sea. Verse 10, the mountains saw you and trembled. The overflowing of water passed by. The deep uttered its voice and lifted its hands on high. Verse 11, the sun and moon stood still in their habitation, and would hearken back to the days of Joshua when they stood still as God was giving a great intervention to the armies of Israel. At the light of your arrows they went, at the shining of your glittering spear. You marched through the land in indignation. You trampled the nations in anger. Verse 13, you went forth for the salvation of your people. So this is the purpose. God will, in a remarkable manner, intervene and overthrow Judah's punisher. And it's for the express purpose of saving his people and restoring them back to the land of Judah. And of course, again, there's a dual fulfillment of that as well, that God will speedily overthrow. In fact, Zechariah 14 speaks of when the feet of Christ stepped down on the Mount of Olives, the earthquake, the mountain split, and then a few verses later, the armies of man standing there, it's like their flesh dissolves from off of the bones. And God, in a remarkable way, completely takes charge. But his purpose was to save his people. Middle of verse 13, you struck the head from the house of the wicked by laying bare from foundation to neck. You know, it was something they did in ancient times. You will remember Joshua did it a number of times. There were 5 kings that were captured. He told some of the leaders, put your foot on their neck. And then Joshua cut off their heads. So by laying bare the foundation to the neck, it's picturing that as well. Let's see, verse 14, thrusting through with arrows, the whirlwind, scattering. Verse 15, you walk through the sea with your horses through the heap of great waters. Verse 16, Habakkuk said, when I heard, my body trembled. My lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered my bones, and I trembled in myself that I might rest in the day of trouble. You know, he's having difficulty dealing with the emotion, the intensity of the message that God has revealed to him. But verse 17, though the fig tree may not blossom, you know, he's looking at his own house of Judah at that time. We may not have the figs that are going to put out any fruit, nor fruit on the vines. We may not have any grapes either. Though the labor of the olive may fail, no olive and no oil, and the fields yield no fruit, so no wheat, no barley. Though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. So we lose our flocks, we lose our herds. Verse 18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. So Habakkuk comes to a peace. He realizes that despite all that Judah is about to go through as they're punished by the Babylonians, Habakkuk has a peace, and he says, I will patiently wait and look to God, you know, for hope and strength. Verse 19, the Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet, and he will make me walk on my high hills. And then the last musical notation to the chief musician with the stringed instruments, or the Hebrew, the old King James has the Hebrew word neganot there. So the Almighty can lift us up, strengthen our feet, so that like Habakkuk, we can run to him for refuge. And as we run toward God and God's commandments, it allows us to outrun our own problems that we bring upon ourselves. Well, let's just summarize here by looking at, I think, four lessons we can draw from Habakkuk's short prophecy. First of all, God supplies the faith necessary to patiently wait and trust in him. And I think we can all relate to that as we see what's going on in the world around us. as we see what is happening in our nation here. In fact, all nations around the world. These are very troubling times. And yet, God can give us the strength, the faith to look to Him, to flee to Him for refuge, and to patiently wait. Secondly, we need to rely on God, even when we do not see all the answers. As far as how everything's going to play out, we're not on the need to know list yet. I suppose when we get a bit closer, God's going to let us know what we need to know at that time. In the meantime, we rely on God, and we know that He's working out His plan, and it's a marvelous plan, and He's going to take care of us, and in the end, His eternal family is going to be built. Thirdly, when we doubt, just remember that there's always hope, because God is in charge. When we doubt, I think we all have these little nagging feelings, sometimes these questions: God, are you there? Are you listening to me? Are you working in my life? And when we have those doubts, let us live by faith and by hope, knowing God's in charge, and we're going to be okay. And then finally, number 4, we overcome doubt by fleeing to God as our refuge. So many times in the Psalms, it makes that statement: flee to God in refuge. So that is our book of Habakkuk, and it is an amazing book. So I'm going to take the notes down